Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Brockton Public Library. I'm glad to see you all here. And I'm happy to tell you that we have a wonderful program tonight. We're going to hear from a Massachusetts native who's been living on another continent long enough to be a visitor now, although this is home. We're going to hear from Mary Jane Cryan, who I will not introduce because we have someone here who can do a better job of introducing Mary Jane. But I just want to tell you that when I found out we had an opportunity to hear from someone who has lived for a long time in Italy, as an expert in Tuscany, which a lot of us have heard about lately, who has been teaching Americans coming to Italy what they need to know to enjoy and get along in the Italian culture, I was pleased, I was thrilled. I said, this is the kind of program we like to have at the Brockton Public Library. So enough from me. I just want to introduce Mary Jane McCool, who will introduce her friend and our guest, Mary Jane Cryan.
Thank you, thank you. I'm the other Mary Jane in our class at Dewaville College in Buffalo, New York. Mary Jane Cryan and I were classmates many years ago, and have recently, in the past 5 or 6 years, become reacquainted through an email group that we've established among our classmates. And so when Mary Jane's travels and interests and her writings about Italy came to light, I thought this might be a wonderful opportunity to share her knowledge and wisdom with other people. And so we arranged a visit. She is here on other business and certainly seeing other wonderful parts of the country. But while she's here visiting in Brockton, we thought it would be nice to share all of what she knows and has stored away so that Brocktonians and people around here can be comfortable visiting her and visiting her region and finding out more about Italy. And so I take great pleasure in introducing my good friend Mary Jane Cryan, and the other Mary Jane, and she will let us know what Italy has in store.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in Brockton. I feel very strange as a Massachusetts native, never having seen this part of my state, because when I was 21, I left. I went across the pond, as they say. And for the past 40 years, I've been living in Italy as a teacher and now as a writer, researcher. And in order to stay young, you have to go back. You have to try to go back into to stay the way you were before. So I found that the secret is sort of from the big city moving to a small town. So that the small towns in Italy have stayed the same way, not like, well, I must say, I really feel like a Rip Van Winkle having come back here and seen the enormous changes too. There's the big trucks and the very, very, very fast traffic in the big malls. To me, it's sort of, it's sort of a shock, and it's not my style of life. And also Rome, where I used to live since 1965, is the same way. It's very international now, and it's become a big city like any other city. So in order to remain the way things were, I moved out of Rome to a small town on the way to Tuscany. That small town is called Vetralla, and if you do a Google search for Vetralla or Viterbo, which is the major provincial town, very little will come up because they're still not famous. They're still not Rome, Venice, Venezia, the places that all the tourists go. But the joys of living in a small town in Italy have been quite well described by many writers. And my little piece, my little contribution to this making our area known has come out in these last 3 books that I've done. Besides writing guidebooks like The Fodors and Designer Bargains in Italy, and another one I did was How to Buy a Home in Italy. Little books like that to entice people to come there. I've also, as a historian and a researcher, I was amazed when I arrived in a small town outside of Rome called Vetralla. I keep repeating it so you will learn it. I thought, oh my goodness, what can a small town like this offer for me as an historian, as a researcher? And one day, as I was finishing the restoration of my big palazzo, which, believe me, I'll never do another one, once is enough for everybody, inside our city hall, I noticed a bust, a marble portrait bust, which you see here in the front of this little book. And this marble bust is of an Englishman, an English cardinal. His name was Henry Cardinal Stuart, the Duke of York. And nobody in the town could explain to me what an English cardinal was doing in our town, up in a niche on the wall, sort of like these gentlemen you see on the walls here. An important person always has, or a benefactor always has his portrait on the wall. This portrait bust had been there since 1802. And the only thing that people could tell me was that it was considered the patron, the dad, the ba. Ba is babbo in Tuscan. They say babbo. This lady's nodding her head. You must be Italian if you've heard babbo.
The other day.
Okay, babbo, which means dad or protector, or the man who's looking over us, watching over us. And the only thing that people could tell me was that when they used to have the parties, the carnival parties, people would dress up and they'd go in the main hall, it would be about as big as this hall, in costume, and they'd dance. And if it was a really successful party, the statue would start to sweat. The beads of vapor would come down on the marble, on the cold marble. And that meant it was a great party. So at the end of a carnival party, they'd say, oh, did the ba sweat? And yeah, it was a great party. So that's the only thing it was known for until I started reading underneath and said, the Duke of York. I said, what in heaven's name is this cardinal doing there? And then from this main hall of our city hall, as you walk down the main staircase, there's a big plaque about as big as that one back there, but in marble, up high, and it has 3 coat of arms on it. And, heraldry is a science. It's not just a, maybe. So looking at the coat of arms on this big marble plaque, you notice in the center the Pope, Julius II. And those of you who have read about Michelangelo know Julius II, what kind of a character he was. He was a very strong Pope. He's the one that made Michelangelo paint the Sistine Chapel. And he was a very strong soldier type, too. He wasn't just a man of the church. And so Julius II's coat of arms in the middle. On one side, we find Henry VIII's coat of arms. Very amazing to find an English king, important like Henry VIII, in a small town in northern Lazio. And on the other side, another coat of arms with squirrels and hatchets and things. And nobody knew who it was. And I was very intrigued because, we Irish girls are curious and we want to get to the bottom of things. And the history of the town had been sort of forgotten over the years because Poor Vitrala was on all of the important routes. And so we've had passing through, Napoleon's troops have passed through, the French have been there. There was even a whole section of town called the French Quarter where their troops were quartered. Then the Russians have been through. We have even some Russian words in our dialect, right? Some Russian words like Buriana. And of course, we've had the Americans, the Germans, the English, everybody's been through. So our archives were sort of, not like these ones here in Brockton that are protected from, people pilfering. But anybody who passed through, they could just go in and choose the things that looked interesting. Oh, that's a nice looking painting. I'll just take that home, So very little was left in our town. So in order to find out what this English connection was, I had to make a trip to England. And now with the wonders of internet, this is a book that you couldn't have done these things 25 years ago, 30 years ago. I wrote on the internet to the British Library in London and asked them if they had these diaries, any diaries of this Cardinal Stuart, Duke of York. And they wrote back and said, yes, we do. We have 36 volumes of his diaries, these huge big books in leather, covered in leather, embossed in gold. And these are the volumes, 1, 2, 3, Roman numerals, right down to 36, and more or less what year, in 1776, 77. So I just pulled a number out of a hat. I said, well, let's try 1776. And because I knew that this cardinal had visited Vitrala in 1776. And I said, well, can I come over? And they said, yes, the book will be waiting for you when you arrive. So I jumped on the next plane to London. And when I opened the volume, 1776, and you know what it's like when you see archival material, it's a big book, you had to put on a big table, and you could still feel the sand, because in those days, after they wrote with their pens, they dusted it off with sand. They didn't use blotting paper. So I was the first one to open these diaries, and it was amazing. I found Viaggio a Viterbo, the travels to Viterbo, 1776, and there followed 25, 35 pages of descriptions of the town I lived in, of the towns nearby, of the Renaissance palaces and the gardens that he visited, what they gave him to eat, because those were good days. Those were the Dolce Vita started back then. Huh? Anytime an important man like a cardinal was visiting, all of the convents, offered him chocolate. Chocolate was a very important drink Nowadays, you know, you just open a little envelope and you get chocolate. In those days, chocolate was only for the very wealthy and only for special occasions. So he would be offered chocolate to drink and special biscotti, something like the ones I see back there, that the nuns made, because that's what their job was, to make biscotti and make marmalades and make all of those wonderful things. And so we have what he ate, what he visited, how the people greeted him, and how he was dressed. Dress was a very ritualistic society then. I'm talking about 1776. What was happening here in 1776? You know, you think of your history, but this was just a drop in the bucket for Italian history. So that's another reason why his visit and all of this connection with the English was sort of, you know, ignored. It was just, you know, some guy passing through. But it would be almost as if here in Brockton or in Boston, somebody discovered the diaries of the visits of, I don't know, somebody really important that's a European, Napoleon maybe, if Napoleon had come here and written about it. I know his brother did. His brother came here, but Napoleon himself never did. So anyway, to get back to the story, I found the diaries, I found this voyage with the descriptions, and that's when this first little book came out. With my local history society, we did a little book so that the people of the trial would know that who he finally was, because nobody really was interested or they knew who he was. And as I was reading, at first I had to decipher, because the handwriting of 1700 is not exactly, you know, computer easy to read. So I had to first learn how to read his script. Actually, it wasn't his script, it was every man of that level did not write his own stuff. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, those of you who are heads of a company, you give your work to your secretary. The secretary writes the letters. Also, he had his private secretary, whose name was Don Giovanni Landau, and he did the actual writing. And of course, it was not exactly, you know, everything he did. I know he did other things on his trips, but they only put in the official stuff, okay? I'd love to find his private diaries. I can imagine what they're about. But anyway, this was an official diary marking down his movements, what he did, who he met, because he was a politician too. This gentleman, this Cardinal Stewart, was the second most important man in the Roman court after the Pope. He was like, you know, the vice pope, if you want to say, the vice president. In fact, when the Pope died, he had to take over the city. He was in charge of everything. So he was a very important gentleman and very, very wealthy. I don't know who you could compare him with today. Perhaps Donald Trump or Bill Gates or somebody really wealthy with lots of money to spend. And how did he spend his money? Painting, villas. He built a seminary in Frascati. He built the whole seminary and the printing press and any kind of art you can imagine. He had it all in his villas. His father-in-law, his grandfather rather, was what was his name? King of Poland. So he had money coming from Poland because his mother was Princess Klementyna Sobieskaja, who was a famous princess, a Polish princess. His father was the former king of England. So you have these two families. James Stewart, James III. So then we have the Old Pretenders. If you know your English history, the Old Pretender was the father, the Polish princess was the mother. They were married in Italy in a rocambolesque way because the English, there was all kinds of spies and things, and she had to escape from Poland dressed as a maid in order to come to Italy to marry the father. And they were married in Montefiascone, which is the town I see from my terrace. And Montefiascone is famous for its wine, est wine. So the whole area where I live is filled with these English connections. In fact, in Montefiascone, even today, there's a wonderful castle. And if you look at the buzzers, you know, the family names, one is MacDonald. There's still the people who followed this couple over in exile. So it's, and they don't speak English anymore, but they're still the same family, the MacDonalds. So it's a little enclave of English history that's fascinating. And the reason why I'm promoting these two books now, why I'm telling people more about it now, is because in the year 2007 will be the bicentenary of the Cardinal Henry's death, and all over the central Italy we'll be having special conferences and things will be happening, hopefully, lots of things, not just in my town, but also in Frascati, where he was bishop for 30 years, and in Bologna and in Florence, because as he traveled, all of these diaries tell now we know what he did. as he traveled, he left gifts for people. Because in those days, you didn't pay your inn or you didn't pay for anything. You were an honored guest, but at the end, you left lovely gifts. Let me show you some of the gifts he gave to some of the people. Here's, for example, if you want to take a close-up of this, this is the manuscript, the first one, the first voyage. So as I was reading the 1776 voyage, it says, oh, we won't talk about Montefiascone because we talked about it when we went last time in 1763. So I said, oh, he did another voyage. So I went back to London, got out the books from 1763, read those, transcribed those, and as I was reading that, it talked about the voyage they did in the other year, the one to Florence. So not only did I find Viterbo, Vetralla, but also descriptions of Florence, Siena, Lucca, all of Tuscany, that people today go and they say, oh, isn't this lovely? But what was it like 250 years ago?